Hello, good day. Hi, I am Michael Chevy Castronova, business editor here at the Gazette and editor of Iowa Ideas Magazine. Thanks for joining us today for this live panel discussion, part of our in-depth series this week. And this week we are focusing on workforce issues in Iowa. These are ahead of our giant annual Iowa Ideas Conference, October 14 and 15. But today we're going to look specifically at barriers to filling workforce needs here in Iowa for employers and for workers and for potential job candidates. First of all, we're going to meet our panel. I'm going to ask each of you in turn, as you appear here on my screen, to introduce yourself, tell us your name, where you work, and just a little bit about what you do there. So Anthony, you are like right here to my left. Would you get us started, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Anthony Harrington. I am from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, managing partner of Top Rank. We're a professional and executive search and diversity consulting firm based out of Cedar Rapids, but we have national presence. And happy to be on board here and having a conversation with you all today.
Dawn, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I am Dawn Oliver Wyand, the Executive Director at the Iowa Women's Foundation. The Iowa Women's Foundation works to break down the barriers that are keeping women from being economically successful. And through our research and community conversations, we learned that childcare was that greatest barrier to economic success for Iowa's women and girls. And we truly believe that that barrier and childcare is interrelated and interdependent on the workforce shortage, and that we have to address both of these issues if we really want to see a change in the workforce in Iowa. And to address those solutions, we established the Building Community Childcare Solutions Collaborative. And I'm excited to be able to share with you today what that collaborative is and the work that that collaborative has been doing across the state for the last 3 to 4 years. So thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
I would look forward to hearing what we've been doing for the past 3 or 4 years about that. Isaiah, sir.
Isaiah Knox, I'm the Executive Director of Urban Dreams, and Urban Dreams is a statewide organization operating in 7 different cities with main offices in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. We focus in 5 different areas: workforce development and education. We have food pantries. We do community connectivity events. We also have mental health counselors, and then substance abuse treatment in all kinds of ways, including outpatient evaluations and OWI jail diversion. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Dr. Timmons, who are you? What do you do?
Hi, everyone. I'm a Service Associate Professor of Economics and also Director of the Knox Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation at West Virginia University. The mission of the Knox Center is to inform citizens, policymakers, and other researchers about the extent, scope, and effects of occupational regulation. Great to be on this Iowa panel today.
Thanks for bringing us with you and having, we can get some kind of outside Iowa perspective maybe. All right, so for those of you watching, very simple, you can submit your questions into the chat box down there at the bottom of your screen. Those will go to our room host, Brian. He will vet those, he'll take a look, he'll pass them on to me. I'll ask the panelists. I ask that you don't wait until the last 10 minutes. To do that, it's okay to submit them as we go along, because you're all going to wait till the end, and then we're going to have that rush, and we might not get to your question. So, all right, so here we go. Our starter question. This is for each of our panelists. What would you say is the one most significant barrier for job candidates trying to enter Iowa's workforce today? And I know that's a big question. It's intentionally a big question. Who would like to start off with? What's the one thing right to mind?
Well, I kind of started answering that question, Michael,
Yes.
in my introduction. So I'll just expand a little bit on that. We truly believe that childcare is that primary barrier right now to the workforce, and especially women. And we've seen what's happened since COVID and women in the workforce. Before COVID in Iowa, we had a shortfall of over 350,000 slots. 1 in 2 children went without access to quality, affordable childcare, and 23% of Iowans lived in a childcare desert. Since COVID, we have seen childcare, the situation get even worse. Not only have centers and in-homes been closing, but now we have an issue with the childcare workforce itself. There just isn't enough out there. We have centers that have openings, but they don't have the workforce to monitor the rooms and to provide the care. Therefore, they're not able to open up those rooms. So to us, it's childcare.
Dawn, when you say 350,000, if I have that number correct, 350,000 slots, are those jobs that were filled and then weren't filled or went away? What do you mean by that?
They were never filled. What we do is we really look at how many children are there, ages 0 to 12 in the state of Iowa, how many childcare slots are there. Now we know that these are slots that are registered and licensed. We know that these are slots done by people we know providing care. It doesn't count the next door neighbor or the aunt or the uncle that's providing care, but there still is a huge shortfall. And so that's how we came up with that 350,000 slot. It still is out there. It has not been addressed yet.
I would add to that. I think I would concur with Don that that's one of the major barriers. And when you think about you conflate that with pay and salary is another issue. I know that there was a concern that if, recently if we released, or cut off the benefits, that was going to force people to go back to work. That's not the case. I mean, when you couple salaries with childcare issues and other external factors, money matters. It doesn't always matter, but it matters. And that's going to impact. And I think the other issue is, I like to say there's a skills gap, but there's also that resistance to a skills gap. There's a lot of employers continuing to look for diamonds in the rough and assuming that if they change their qualifications, that they are lowering their expectations. They're not lowering your expectations. You're changing the expectations, in my opinion. The question is, what are you going to do as an employer to develop somebody once you acquire the talent? Can you invest more in the development of those individuals as opposed to wanting folks to come in polished and ready to hit the ground running, depending on the position? So it's a big question, a lot of factors.
For our annual business awards, I interviewed, this would have been a few weeks ago, although it seems like yesterday, but a few weeks ago, I interviewed the RAND economist, Dr. Catherine Ann Edwards, Anthony, and she said just what you just said. Employers need to make some kind of investment because you're not going to find the person who is a welder, who speaks German, and also has a degree in marine biology. You're just going to have to do some training.
Yep, absolutely.
A lot of things we're seeing at Urban Dreams with our clients is, first of all, knowledge that these employment opportunities even exist, and then access to those opportunities and how to even go about applying for those or bridging that gap. And then the fear on both sides of the unknown. And like Anthony said, and like Michael, you said, the employers have just as much fear as kind of that culture shift that takes to bring on underserved and marginalized populations into their organization. But the fear exists on the other side too, with underserved, underemployed, unemployed, and marginalized populations coming into a brand new corporate culture where maybe no one in their family has ever experienced anything like that. Or if someone in their family did experience an organization like that in the past, they didn't have a good experience. So there's a lot on both sides that we need to learn.
Absolutely.
I think all my fellow panelists make some excellent points. I think from my standpoint, sometimes well-meaning regulation gets in the way. And there was one specific instance of that a couple of years ago. There was a barber in Iowa by the name of William Burt, and he was planning on opening a mobile barber shop to cater to individuals. And I mean, you would think with COVID having some of that flexibility for people that perhaps didn't feel comfortable going into a barbershop to get a haircut, they would have likely liked to have that opportunity. But unfortunately, the law in Iowa prevented an individual from opening a shop that didn't have a physical location. Now, thankfully, that law was changed, but there are other instances like that where, again, you want to make sure that consumers are protected. You want to get regulation right, but you also want to make sure that it isn't stopping workers or stopping entrepreneurs from entering the labor force.
Yeah, there are reasons for some of those regulations, but there needs to be some nimbleness and when situations like this change. So yeah. Isaiah and Anthony, I think this is for you. And this is an open-ended question again. We've all talked about the need to get new workers to move to Iowa. We've been talking about that for as long as I've lived here, which has been about a decade. How important is that, say, compared with more engagement with the people who are already here in Iowa? I mean, we need to do both, right? And Isaiah, if you could talk a little more, you had mentioned Urban Dreams, and you talked about letting people know about that these jobs exist. How do you do that? And I realize that's a trick question because I already know the answer, but if you could talk about that for a bit.
Yeah. That was the last question. So now I'll give that answer first.
Okay.
So we go with a lot of non-traditional avenues in order to let people know in communities that are underserved that these opportunities exist and that the employers want to have them come there. So we'll work with employers to make sure that, like Anthony said before, maybe some of those expectations are not lowered, but adjusted in order to make an easier transition into the organization. But then we'll do things like door knock, right? We'll use massive social media boosts and campaigns in order to make sure that people are aware of these opportunities. So the best thing, or go to communities where they are, because we have to get out of our house and go into their house in order to make them trust us, and then to make those steps towards those opportunities to get that gainful employment. And then we look at it twofold, right? Once we figure out how to lift people out of poverty or how to lift people out of at risk or those other social determinative health barriers that occur, then we can start to reduce some of those things, and we can reduce crime in our community. We can have people that are hopeful. We can get people that affordable and quality childcare that they need, right? And then everybody in our community is more prosperous and we live in a better place. So that's kind of what we do.
Yeah, I would concur 1000% with Isaiah. Michael, I know that your question, do you worry about keeping people here versus attracting new talent into our state? And I think you said it ahead of time, but you can't do one without the other. You just can't do it. It's the leaky bucket syndrome, right? You don't want to continue to try to bring talent here, by the way, and not set up a culture, if you're talking about diversity and equity, where they want to stay, when you've got a leaky bucket of young talent or smart talent leaving the state. So they have to happen together. And to Isaiah's point, you have to find non-traditional ways to look for talent. If you're going to continue to beat your head against the wall doing the same thing, you get the same results. And there's that fear. It's that, Isaiah touched on it earlier, that fear like we all have of trying something different. I recall sitting, with a client a couple of years ago, asking about how they wanted to find talent. They had a location in Southwest United States, and we were talking about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And I asked the individual, the leader, have you thought about visiting a school? And, I'm a pretty transparent guy, so I'll say the person was a white female, and the look that I got was a deer in headlights. And I knew what the answer was, but I wasn't so much concerned about the answer, but why the answer was what it was. And the answer really was, I'm white. I'm not sure I can go to a Black school and ask for talent. And that's a natural feeling. You have to respect that, but it's not a good feeling, because anybody should be able to walk into an HBCU and look for talent. Have you tried it? Have you crossed that river, right? And so the question is, are we willing to look in different places for talent? And that's just one example of many, but to Isaiah's point, non-traditional, we have to think outside the box.
Well, let's stay on this for a second, because we do have a question from someone watching. Are organizations prepared for the kind of changes that we're talking about in the workplace? So Anthony, you saw that kind of reluctance to go to a Black college or university. Are there some other things that you've seen in which employers here in Iowa have been reluctant to try this? And Ed, I'm going to come to you on this in a moment. Have you seen that kind of other kind of resistance? Are there other elements that have come up?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Michael. That resistance, again, I say some of it's natural, some of it's willful, but absolutely. When you talk about underrepresented groups coming into an organization that may not be accustomed to that, there's some resistance, not only to how do I attract the right talent, but what is my culture? How do I build my culture? And what does my culture look like? And culture is a broad term, right?
Right.
And so how do we define that, and what does that look like? Are we prepared to receive individuals that we are typically not used to seeing, be that ethnicity or other underrepresented status as well? So definitely there's resistance right here in our backyard.
So this is probably not just a thing here in Iowa, right?
No, certainly not.
What have you seen, Dr. Timmons, in your broad economic view of the world? What else have you seen like this? Or is it just us?
No, I mean, Iowa is certainly not alone with respect to occupational licensing and the restrictions that it places upon workers. And it should be noted that policymakers in Iowa really deserve to be commended for enacting a significant reform last year that allowed workers from other states to transfer their licenses into Iowa. That was a real significant reform, and it really established Iowa as a leader with respect to welcoming out-of-state workers. But I think there's still work to be done with respect to the restrictions that Iowa imposes upon its workforce. One national study indicates that Iowa ranks 12th with respect to how broadly and strictly occupations are licensed. 24% of the workforce in Iowa is licensed. That's the second highest in the country. And it's been estimated that that costs the state more than 48,000 jobs each year. Just a couple of examples, and again, we're not saying that, regulation should be eliminated. It's the idea of getting regulation right so consumers are protected and you aren't imposing some of these costs. Barbers and cosmetologists, as an example. In Iowa, they're required to complete 2,100 hours of education and training. That's the most in the country. Just as an example, EMTs are only required to complete 110 hours of education and training. So, is that level of education and training necessary to make sure that consumers are protected? Or is it possible that we're simply imposing unnecessary costs and barriers to individuals that might be looking to start a new profession or enter the workforce?
Isaiah, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to especially follow with Dr. Timmons on some case studies that have been done nationally and replicated over and over again, and actually started at the University of Chicago, which is close by, where resumes, and these are traditional hiring practices, so resumes of both Black sounding names and white sounding names that get sent in, and no matter industry wide, no matter if they look identical, the white sounding name will get 50% more callbacks. Well, that study now has went back to even understanding that where you're from matters as well. So addresses will matter, or schools that you went to will matter. So in Des Moines, if you went to a certain high school, you may have inflated self-worth, or employers may think of you as more worthy or more capable of entering that job. And the same things in Cedar Rapids. I can think of a handful of different schools where that will occur, or even colleges in Iowa now will have that. So we have to make sure those are kind of traditional aspects that we've uncovered that have created artificial barriers because of the employer's practice of traditional hiring.
To kind of expand on Tim's point too, that I like what what Ed said, that sure, we have to have these regulations, but sometimes it's not what the regulation is, but it's access to complete the certification or the cost, right? Is it money, or is it about education? And I think there's a financial factor that it creates a barrier as well.
Okay, so Dawn, not to leave you out of this conversation, so we're going to bring you in here. Speaking of employing more people who already reside here, I'm thinking of a column you wrote a couple years ago for Iowa Ideas Magazine, and you talked about the survey. And it was just one, I think, or were there two? The survey Iowa Women's Foundation did, in which you found that the number one issue was not enough childcare, and the number two issue, I believe, if I remember correctly, was transportation. Could you talk about why those findings are important, and particularly what they mean for employers? Why, and so what does that mean? And the trick question, if things gotten better or worse, and I know you talked about that a little bit when we started out here.
Well, and I also want to add too, from what Anthony and Isaiah and we're saying is that, yes, you need the education and you need the training, but if you have children, you can't work and you can't get that education and training if you don't have somebody to help watch your children. I'm going to sound like a broken record before this panel is over today, but we know that because of a lack of childcare, people aren't able to access the training that they need or the work or the jobs that they need. And we can't get people to come into our state if there isn't childcare. We have HR directors who tell me all the time, we are in competition for talent. And I have had people specifically turn down jobs because there was not childcare in that community. We need to make some investments in childcare, and we need to figure out how we can help with that. But childcare wasn't the only barrier to success. And that's what you were referencing, Michael, when you said transportation. We also know that housing, education and training, mentors also play a barrier. But again, childcare was identified as that primary barrier. And so that's why we're focusing on that one for now. And we have not seen it get better. We've kind of leveled off. We were doing really well before COVID hit, and then COVID hit. And now we're also addressing not only the shortfall in availability, but the shortfall in the workforce itself. So we're working hard in a lot of different areas to try to come up with solutions. And we do have some solutions for businesses. I know that we formed a group called the Iowa Child Care Business Coalition, which is made up of business leaders from the top businesses in the state, who really put together a toolkit for their colleagues to use, 6 possible solutions that these businesses could look at to increasing the availability of childcare for their employees. But not only have we put together those solutions, but we're also willing to provide some one-on-one coaching and direct support to these businesses to help them move these solutions to action. So we know that we really want to see action. We really want to see some changes take place so more people can go to work and our businesses can flourish as we move forward.
Ed, how unusual, again, I'm asking you the same question. What do you see? I mean, how different is this, all of the things that Dawn just mentioned and Isaiah and Anthony, how different is this here? Or is this kind of happening everywhere or some places or the upper Midwest? Or put this in perspective.
It's a national issue, and occupational licensing has spread to a lot of professions where I think from a public safety perspective, it can be a little bit more difficult to justify. Just to give everybody some perspective, in the 1950s, about 5% of the workforce was subject to licensing. We were requiring doctors to get a license. We were requiring dentists to get a license, where there's some clear public safety issues where we want to make sure that the regulation is protecting consumers. But I think it's harder to justify making it illegal for an individual to provide a massage or to give a haircut before meeting specific requirements. I think, and again, it's not a binary choice between no regulation at all and licensing, which is the strictest form of occupational regulation. We could, for instance, require the barbershops be inspected if we're worried about the cleanliness of the barbershops. we could require that barbers complete some mandatory sanitation training. But it isn't necessarily clear why 2,100 hours is the right regulatory hurdle, particularly when a state like New York, where there's a lot of barbers shops and a lot of barbers, there is no mandated minimum education requirements. And there's a number of other states that require barbers to complete about half of the education and training that Iowa barbers are required to complete. In the United Kingdom, barbers aren't licensed at all. Barbers can get a private certification if they choose, but individuals are able to set up a barber shop without completing a minimum amount of education and training. And I'm not aware of any evidence that consumers have been harmed as a result of that regulatory regime.
Other than Sweeney Todd. But yes,
that's right. I haven't heard anything about that in the UK.
Okay. All right. So, Anthony, before we go, there's a question here from someone watching. Before I get to that, Anthony, could you talk just for a bit, because we've kind of been going around this. What are the benefits, because you're a recruiter, right? What are the benefits for recruiting from a more diverse talent pool? Maybe we need to spell this out. Why should employers want to do that rather than what they've been doing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a number of benefits, but let's just look at two at the 10,000 foot level for the purposes of today. Really, there's a moral case for why it's important to hire diverse talent, and there's a business case. But first, understanding what diversity means, and I've always said this, that Black people and women don't own that word. So first and foremost, do we understand what diversity means when we're looking for diversity? Because there's what can add value to an organization is diversity of thought as well, right? And diversity of thought could lead to a diversity of ethnicity or location or region of the country and the world. So I think there's always a value of knowledge when you've got diverse thoughts, and those thoughts could come directly from diverse communities, ethnically diverse communities, or gender diverse communities. So the moral case is it's the right thing to do. It's the human thing to do to have a diverse organization. And many of us are more diverse than we think we are when we think about the word. But there's a business case, and there's money to be made for the CEO that's trying to spend $1 and make $2. There's an opportunity to spend $1 and make $1.75 and take 25 cents and reinvest it in more diverse talent to grow the knowledge of your organization, to grow the innovation of your organization, and to grow your customer base and your reach. I used to tell the story, my daughter's a model, and I often tell the story about Victoria's Secret, which we all know is an amazing, long-lasting organization. And I think an organization like that got very big about 3 years ago made a mistake. And their mistake was not paying attention to the diversity of the customer base and the demographic changes in our country. When you look at what the definition of beauty is. And they were asked that question publicly, why don't you have a number of larger women in your fashion shows or in your stores or what you're selling? And the answer by a chief marketing officer that had been there 40 plus years was that we are selling a fantasy. What's that mean? Maybe that meant something 40 years ago, but were you paying attention to your customer base today? So if you look around the country, and you can go Google this up and look at what happened to Victoria's Secret post that conversation, you'll understand how that plays a factor. So hope that kind of gives you some perspective there.
Dawn, anything you want to add to that from your surveys and what you've seen?
I think you probably saw me physly react.
Yes, that's why.
I was like, wow. Yeah, it's important to know, what your market is and who you're trying to reach and what your message is and how best to get that out, for everything. And, we did that with childcare when we recognized this really became an economic issue. And we wanted people to talk about it as an economic issue. We looked at our messaging, we looked at who our messengers were, and we went out and made some changes to make that happen. And so I think we need to what Anthony said makes total sense to me. Now let's just get them some childcare so we can get them into the state and
Yes.
get things going.
Yes.
So here comes the question from somebody watching, and Isaiah, this follows a little bit on from what you were talking about. Urban Dreams is knocking on doors and telling people about their job. Their jobs exist, but then what do the employers have to say? And the question is, how does Iowa overcome the negative views it has from being a welcoming state? And this is, of course, presuming Iowa has negative views. Understanding the past year of legislation, rankings for African Americans living in the state, and other videos that paint a different picture of Iowa being welcoming. What intentional efforts need to happen? And I guess this is the question. What intentional efforts need to happen versus just recruiting at HBCUs, Latino serving institutions? I think the question is, what do employers, how do we need to really think as a hiring manager? How do I need to think differently? And what do I need to do to overcome what this person is calling a negative view of Iowa to get people to come from elsewhere or to stay here, I guess? And I know that's a big question.
That's a big question. I'll try my best to focus in, and I think I can focus that in one simple statement. What I tell people all the time is, don't do this because of the political pressure or the outside pressure. Do this because, as Anthony said, it's the right thing to do. There's a business case, it's the moral thing to do. But while you're doing it, make sure that you're authentic in the process, right? You're not just checking a box, but it's really something that you are going to live and breathe as a culture inside your company. And that's the best advice I think that I can give to anybody, because if you're not going to be authentic and you're not going to really dig deep into these issues, then it's just going to be sugar-coated and, lack of a better term, whitewashed and out the door when the next big thing hits. So if you're authentic, people know it, clients know it, local, statewide, national, they'll know, then they'll be able to see it.
And said it better myself. Authenticity is so important in this process, and this has to start with leaders. I'm not a big believer in trickle down economics, but I'm a big believer in trickle down philosophy when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if leaders aren't willing to take the arrows, because this isn't it's a never-ending journey to try to become a welcoming state. It may not happen in our lifetimes, but are we working towards it? And leaders have to be outside of a position of complacency to do that, and be willing to take some of those challenging arrows and criticisms that come along with trying to make change. That's a challenge.
Ed, what guidance do you have for us? What are you seeing elsewhere? How are other places tackling this?
Yeah, I mean, with respect to occupational licensing, I mean, as I mentioned, Iowa's already emerged as the leader, with respect to accepting other states' licenses, and I think that's a huge and important reform. But I think some other states can be looked to with respect to making sure that regulation is meeting consumer needs and not preventing individuals from entering the workforce. There's a handful of states, for example, Ohio and Mississippi, that have enacted review processes for their existing licensing. And again, nobody's saying we want to do wholesale elimination of regulation, but it's just a matter of making sure that regulation is in fact the right size, so that you aren't potentially discouraging individuals from entering the workforce. Because as my fellow panelists have acknowledged, for a lot of aspiring workers, these barriers can be quite onerous. The expense associated, for example, with completing college can be just far too great. So are there other alternative means, whether it be apprenticeships, whether it be other ways of making sure that workers have the training that they need, and to make sure that they have the right to enter the workforce and participate and get their little piece of the American dream?
And you mentioned apprenticeships. And we've talked about those, and there are some here in Iowa. What have you seen elsewhere, and how successful are those, and what kinds of apprenticeships have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on the specific trade or the specific profession, I mean, I think they can be, in many cases, a superior replacement for traditional college education. I think on-the-job, hands-on training in many instances is preferable for, there's a skilled worker shortage in Iowa and everywhere in the country. And I think part of that challenge is making sure that these aspiring workers have access to the training that they need, and also making sure that the regulation is such that there are these alternative pathways. One of my good friends at Harvard University, Peter Blair, writes about this in some research that he's done. And, I think just making sure that there are these alternative pathways and that the regulation aligns so that if an individual completes an apprenticeship, that they'll get the proper credit so that they can begin working.
Anthony, when you're trying to recruit someone, and you work with people outside Iowa too, yes, to bring them
Yes, I do.
here. And have you seen reluctance on the part of people saying, "Yeah, I don't want to move there"?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How do you
To
overcome
Iowa?
that? Yeah.
Moving to Iowa?
How do you overcome
Absolutely.
that?
So we're in Eastern Iowa. So us recruiters, we always like to play little tricks and games. I'm just being funny. Actually, I think about how do you leverage region, right? How do you leverage region when you're small, when you're a relatively smaller location? How do you leverage region? So I've always sold this market as such a wonderful place to have things to do. But if you love big city life, you're a day trip to Chicago, you're a day trip to Minneapolis, you're 5 hours to St. Louis, you're 5 hours to Omaha. So if big city life matters to you, but you want to live inexpensive and have access to that, because if we come from larger cities, well, we're used to traveling. People are used to traveling an hour or two in larger cities. Do they know that Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for example, or Eastern Iowa or Des Moines, Iowa, do they know how close we are to Minneapolis and larger cities? So how do we leverage that, right? How do we leverage that and couple that with what is happening in our own region, the regionalism that we have? So, I try to do that. I try to leverage the relationships between our larger cities, particularly Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, and Waterloo. I try to leverage the amenities in those cities as well. So we have to leverage what is inside our state and our relationship to what is around us, because we're global citizens and people get around. And I try to respect that and consider that, particularly people coming from coastal markets or areas that are much larger cities.
So, Don, when you're talking to business leaders, do you have to does this come up often that you need to talk to them about thinking outside the geographic box, that they need to be looking elsewhere, and how we make this more welcoming?
What we're doing is saying to them, you need to look locally and see what it is that you need and what is it that you can do, because it's going to be different from community to community and business to business. But step out of that box, be creative, look at different ways to address it, because the traditional ways we've been doing things just aren't going to work anymore. For example, everybody thought childcare was a family issue. It's not a family issue anymore. It's an economic issue that's being looked at by business leaders and by community leaders. We need to be creative, and we need to figure out what is it going to take. And I think my colleagues on this call have given some really good examples today.
Well, what are some things? I remember a place I worked at in another state where we had need to hire more people, and we knew that a number of the people we already had were of that age where they were all talking about they wanted to have children, and there was no daycare. We were in a warehouse space just outside town, and somebody, might have been me, had this great idea that, can we go get somebody who runs a daycare and help them with the rent and have them move in to this part, like right next door to us. And oh, look, they're right there on site essentially. And we did that, and that worked for, they may still be there. I don't know. I know the newspaper isn't, but I believe that the daycare center might still in fact be right there in downtown Columbus.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, you're right, Mike. What we've done is we've put together, as I said earlier, a toolkit. And this toolkit has 6 possible solutions that a business can look at to implementing and supporting childcare for their employees. It's simple stuff from like flexible work arrangements and offer a flexible spending account. But go even bigger. Look at possible providing backup care, providing emergency care, on-site care, or partnering with local child care centers and in-home providers in certain ways. We've got the tools. We've been maintaining lists of what different partnerships look like. We're willing to share that. Call the Women's Foundation, go to our website, look for the toolkit. We'll also connect you to businesses that have already made these kind of investments who are willing to share resources and tools and knowledge. Let's work together on this. This is not something that should be seen as competitive. It's also not something that's, it's also nonpartisan. Let's figure out how can we create quality, affordable childcare that's sustainable so we can bring people into this state and they can work. They can get the education they need. They can take up the advantage of the apprenticeships. Let's see what we can do together.
okay,
Don
devil's
makes a
advocate.
great point.
Go ahead, Anthony. Go ahead. Sorry.
I think Don makes a great point. I think there's opportunities for city government to step up to the plate a little more as well. This is where my sarcasm, I know, probably kicks in a little bit, but how many golf courses do we need in a city? Can we cut back one hole? Can we, there's all kinds of ways that there's, it's philosophical, but there are resources in our communities that are being misappropriated, in my opinion, that we could really use in other ways, and daycare would be a valuable way. So,
and Anthony, let me add to that, because we know that there's a lot of funding coming into the state through the ARPA funds. So
yes.
We know that there's state dollars, but we also know that there are county and city dollars.
Yes.
And one of the things I'm hearing is that a number of our smaller communities under 50,000, as far as cities goes and our counties, aren't taking advantage of those dollars for one reason or another. And one of the things we're trying to do really hard now is we're putting together some talking points. Why should they? Why should these city and county municipalities come together and work on childcare and use some of these ARPA funds so we can address the issue?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to remind people we're down to our last 15 minutes. So if you've got questions, thoughts, now's the time to put them in there. So Don, here's my devil's advocate question. You're mentioning these 6 things in the toolkit that I, as an employer, could use. Isn't that expensive?
Well, I've got business leaders who will sit down with you and show you how, by making those initial investments, it's helping their bottom line. It's saving on recruitment and retention costs. It's saving on work productivity loss because of people who have to leave early or come in late. We've got all kinds of data that we can share with you that shows how much we're losing in this state annually because of the childcare issues. And what we turn around and invest is going to far exceed what we're, and it's going to make a difference and it's going to help.
I'm no childcare expert, except for that I do have 3 children and they all had childcare. So I know
that makes you a childcare expert.
they're very expensive.
The three made you an expert.
I know it's very expensive, but I would also want to think that the longitudinal advantage of quality early childcare and after school care and before school care will create a better workforce in the future because of that education gap that gets lost because we often don't have students going to quality daycares or preschools and starting off in the right foot with their education.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, Isaiah, because quite honestly, we know that our brains develop the most from birth to 5, and that's when they need all of those kind of experiences, but many of them don't obtain it. And when we talked earlier about the message and the messenger, and it's important, quite honestly, we don't use that very often when we're talking to business leaders, because that doesn't impact the bottom line today. That'll impact the bottom line in the future. But right now, everybody's looking at the today. And so we're really trying to talk more about what's that economic impact. But quite honestly, at the Women's Foundation, we're also looking at that long-term impact on our children.
Yeah.
So Ed, what's the economic model here? Can you make an economic argument for why daycare and these other issues you're talking about are important?
I think so. I mean, I think that
Absolutely.
there's good arguments that could be made to support everybody's points today. And, you know, I think, again, I just come back to the point of trying to make sure that the regulatory mix is right. You know, we want to make sure that consumers are protected, that the consumers don't receive poor quality service. But at the same time, we don't want to make the restrictions so severe that individuals don't have the opportunity to enter the workforce, that individuals don't have the opportunity to take that first step towards starting their career.
Ed, I'm curious, and I'm not an education expert, but when I think about certifications, I also think about, and we're talking about developing our kids, there's a massive, I know enough to talk about it, but I don't know enough to understand how to solve it. But there's a massive challenge, as I understand, in the state of Iowa with how teachers' certifications and licenses are transferred to the state. And we're losing talented teachers, diverse teachers, ethnically diverse teachers, to be specific, because of the regulations. If I come from, I think they call it reciprocity. If I come from Illinois, does my license transfer here? And apparently we're one of the most difficult states in the country to come to as a teacher from another state with our license and have it transferable, which is impacting our kids. And so I'd be curious of your thoughts on that.
No, and you know, I think one has to wonder if somebody is experienced and you know, they can provide evidence that they're a capable and qualified teacher, and they're working in another state outside of Iowa, and they'd like to move to Iowa, then, you know, why not provide a easy mechanism for individuals to begin working? And I mentioned the reform that was enacted in Iowa, and I think that's an important step towards moving in that direction. But I mean, I think it's important to make sure that you have the right amount of teachers, that you have some degree of diversity with respect to the teaching workforce, because I mean, there's evidence that suggests that if students have teachers that look like them, you know, they can serve as role models and they'll be a lot more likely to succeed. So, I mean, I think, you know, having access to those role models, particularly early in life, is vitally important to make sure that every single resident in Iowa has access to a pathway to success.
Yeah, there have been all those studies done. I remember seeing them 10 years ago of, okay, you're a Black child in a school, and what do your teachers look like? What does your principal look like? And, you know, that whole working to get people of color in those positions too, or allowing them into those positions.
Yeah.
Whether that's getting them from other states or whatever, wherever it is. Okay, so, you know, you can't drive much of anywhere in any Iowa metropolitan area without seeing now hiring signs. They're everywhere. Are you seeing, this is a kind of an anecdotal question, but are you seeing, you here on the panel, are you seeing businesses change how they're trying to attract people who may have been excluded from the workforce? Are you seeing any of these attitudinal changes that you're talking about that we need?
I think we're seeing some. I mean, I think I'm seeing some. You know, I don't think it's fast enough and enough, but certainly there are some organizations who are trying to think differently about how they're acquiring talent. They're listening more, but for the most part, it continues to be a challenge to get organizations to think differently, other than putting that yard sign or the balloon, what do you call them, win things in the,
The things
the
you always see
yard
out
that says-
outside car lots. Yeah.
Those,
yeah.
I forgot what you call them, but,
Right.
are we investing, in that area? When we talk about marketing, a lot of times when companies, when there are challenges with funding, usually the marketing is the first place to start cutting, marketing and people. And I always find that odd. How about we increase the investment in marketing and people? But I think it's getting better. I think we've still got a ways to go in terms of, at least in what I'm seeing.
Isaiah, when you're talking to businesses, because you say we've identified some folks and they're doing these other jobs, they're doing these other things, we think they'd be a great fit. What kind of response do you usually get? And I'd be curious how that works anyway.
Yeah, so I'm just pulling up our numbers here so I can look at it. And quarterly, we're getting between 450 and 550 applicants for all the jobs that we post. And we've already talked to employers about those jobs and helped them to understand that we're going to get a diverse set of candidates that are probably underemployed, or some that may be unemployed or reentering the workforce. And as we're moving them through the process, and we're helping to vet them, and we're using curriculums like Skills to Pay the Bills for those critical soft skills that people need when they're moving over. As we're sending them to employers, what we're finding out is that they're still having some barriers that are internal, that denials are still happening. Even though we've had the conversation before, we know this applicant is qualified and competent to do the position, they're still being denied. So sometimes we'll have to go back and advocate and help them to unpack that, to look at why that denial happened. And in many cases, they've re-interviewed, hired them, and they've been some of their loyal and most productive employees because of that. But without someone like, Anthony or Dawn or Urban Dreams helping to advocate for them, they would just be back in the wind, unemployed or underemployed. So yes, there are some, not enough though, as Anthony said.
Dawn, you seem to be agreeing here.
Well, in the childcare industry, what we've done is we knew we had to start looking at how could we recruit differently and how could we attract talent to the childcare field itself. And so we're really looking at what are some of those innovative ways, and what are some of those things they're doing in the business world that we can incorporate into the childcare world.
What are some of those things?
Well, those are good questions. So we're looking at hiring bonuses. We're looking at longevity bonuses. We're looking at training. We're looking at who are we recruiting and how can we look at groups that have never been considered before, like maybe recent retirees, or going to churches and looking to find groups. I mean, we're looking and stepping out of the box to see what we can do.
If I could just jump in, I think one of the greatest tragedies, and it's not just Iowa, I think this is a national issue. We have this significant pool of talent. You have a lot of individuals that at some point in their life made a mistake. They had an encounter with the criminal justice system.
Right.
And because of that mistake, they find themselves unable to reconnect with the labor force. And occupational licensing does play some role here. You might be excluded from working. Now, I think, if you are an individual that has a certain kind of crime, I think we can make a good argument that you shouldn't be in that specific profession. But if you committed a simple misdemeanor and your crime is completely unrelated to your ability to do the job, why do we want to forbid them from having that opportunity? And there's a lot of research that suggests if individuals don't have the opportunity to re-enter the workforce and re-enter civil society, they're much more likely to recidivate. So, finding some way to get all of this great talent that's out there, a way to reconnect with the workforce, I think would go a long way towards easing some of these shortages that we're currently experiencing.
So rethinking and just applying some common sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So what Isaiah said
Yes,
earlier,
Anthony.
it's what Isaiah was saying earlier. It's fear by employers of what to expect from this underrepresented population, which happens to be reentry citizens, is what I call them. And I spend a lot of time and passion in that area. You know, here in the state of Iowa, and I believe nationally, 95% of people who leave the penal system are coming to our backyards. So the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to pay for them to return? Or maybe we invest in them becoming citizens in our community. So great point, Ed. I agree.
Okay, so we are at our, I think, 3 or 4 minutes here. So this is the speed dating portion of our panel. This is one question for each of you. Executive answer. What's the one thing that employers can do to help remove some of these barriers we've been talking about? One thing. Go. Anthony, what's the one thing? What's the top thing comes to your mind?
Invest money in diversity, equity, and inclusion heavily.
Isaiah, what do you think?
Reach out to experts in the field and have them help you to invest in DEI.
Dawn, your turn.
Invest in childcare solutions.
Ed, what do you think?
If you're concerned about occupational regulation like me, reach out to your local policymaker. Let them know and tell them that this is an issue that you're concerned about in Iowa.
Okay, good point. This has been a great discussion. And for those of you watching, remember, we've had other panels. We had Monday, Tuesday, we've got a panel tomorrow. We have a panel on Thursday. Also around in here floating is a recording I did last week with Andy Challenger of Challenger Gray and Christmas. You can see that on our website. If you have not yet registered for our Iowa Ideas Conference, and I don't know why you haven't, but if you haven't registered yet, that will also be online. It will also be free this year. It's October 14 to 15. Those are live. You can do that right here on this same website. We will have 3 keynote speakers this year. David Gould, visiting professor at the University of Iowa's Public Policy Center. Peggy Whitson, NASA astronaut, you've heard of her. Thomas Abt, author of Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence. I want to thank our panel. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for watching. And I think that's us for today. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
Keep
you.
all.
watching.
Thank you all.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody. Thank you.